10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 328. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 328 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Thank you all for joining me yet again, and if you're new to the show, welcome in. We are super happy that you're here. So today we're going to dive into part 6, which will be the last part of our series on Charlie Parker, and we're going to talk a little bit about the texture of his lines and how you can think about recreating them, and again, just trying to get ourselves as deep as possible into the playing of this pioneer of music and bebop. But before we jump into the show, as always, just wanted to remind you that this is a listener-supported podcast, which means we rely on listeners just like you to support the show, keep it coming out week in and week out in high quality. And we do that in the form of a small monthly donation with which you get access to a PDF from every single episode, audio examples, all sorts of fun stuff like that. And we use the Patreon platform to support ourselves here. So you can find that by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners and getting yourself signed up today. Quick shout out to some new patrons. Thank you to our new $5 patron, Sandy, and our new $3 patron, Lonnie. Thank you guys so much for joining up with the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family. And again, if you want all the learning materials that go along with this episode and every single episode that we've ever done, head over to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today. You get instant access to all 328 PDFs that we have ever done. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to finish up the series on Charlie Parker today by looking at the way that he uses vertical versus horizontal playing in his phrases to create a really compelling way of putting together solos. And this is something that I noticed from Charlie Parker's playing almost right from the get-go. And I think this is something, while a little bit less specific, can really go a long way toward helping you play more interesting and ultimately compelling solos. So we've got 3 more examples this week. We're going to go through them one by one, and we're going to examine how he uses scale-based lines as opposed to arpeggio-based lines, and how he kind of balances out the two. So let's clarify what I'm talking about a little bit before we jump into the actual examples. So when I say scale-based lines or horizontal lines, what I'm really talking about is portions of the phrase that are based off of generally half steps and whole steps. So Charlie Parker is utilizing scale patterns. He's playing up and down the scale rather than the other form of line, which I would define as arpeggio-based or vertical playing, where he's mostly using intervals of a third or wider. Now, as a caveat to this rule, now you know by this point there's always exceptions to the rule. You will see a wider interval than a whole step from time to time in what I'm describing as horizontal lines, but I'm looking at the general makeup of the line, and if there happens to be an interval of a third or a fourth in those horizontal lines, that's okay. I'm looking at it on a little bit of a wider view, a little bit more of a 10,000 foot view. And some of those wider intervals can fit into a horizontal line if it's in the right context. Now, as confusing as that might be, I think once we get into the examples, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, and you'll see the stark difference between when Charlie Parker is playing horizontally versus vertically. So let's dive in. Let's take a look at example number 1. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the reason why I chose this one as example number 1 is I think it's the clearest. I think it's the clearest example of the difference between a scale-based pattern, horizontal, versus an arpeggio-based pattern, vertical. So what I've done on the PDF is I have color-coded all of the horizontal stuff in blue and then all of the vertical stuff in red, so that you'll have a very, very easy to look at representation of which one I think he's playing. So if we look at the first measure and a half, you're going to notice that it's basically all whole steps and half steps. He's playing off of that concert B flat 7 Mixolydian scale. Then he does a little bit of chromaticism at the beginning of the second measure. And then right on beat 3 of the second measure, we see him jump into 2 arpeggios. The first arpeggio is based off of the fifth, and it's comprised of all thirds. And then the second one is a mix of intervals, but generally it's wider than a third. There's one minor third, and then the rest of the stuff is much wider. And then he finishes up by coming back to a little bit of chromaticism to lead into that last note of the example. So what does this tell us about Charlie Parker's playing? What does this tell us about what we can do? Well, we want to vary the texture of our solos. If we were to play an entire solo based off of whole steps and half steps, it would get pretty boring. So what we see Charlie Parker doing is, if he plays a phrase using a scale-based pattern, very quickly after that, he's going to jump into a more vertical arpeggio-based pattern and then switch again. And we see this in his playing constantly, and what it does is it keeps the solos really, really interesting. Remember, when you play a wind instrument or any kind of single line instrument that's not able to play chords, you really have to think about your interval structure, and that's really what Charlie Parker is doing here. He's never getting into something where he's playing multiple phrases just based off of arpeggios or multiple phrases just based off of scale patterns. He's always switching it up to make you want to keep listening. So let's dive into example number 2, and we're going to see this happen again. This one's a little bit longer and a little bit more complicated, but let's check it out. Here's example number 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're going to notice I've color-coded this one in the exact same way as the last one. And what we see in this one is he's actually starting off with an arpeggio-based pattern. And then at the beginning of the second measure, he's going into a bunch of chromatic playing and a little scale pattern at the end there coming down. And then in the third measure on beat 2, he interjects with a quick arpeggio on a triplet, which really does make this line as dynamic as any line that I've ever seen. Immediately after that triplet, we see a chromatic line leading down to the fourth measure of the phrase, and then he finishes everything up with 2 arpeggio patterns into the very last note. So you can see how rapidly he changes back and forth between horizontal and vertical, and the way that he's always thinking about where's going to be the best place in this line to interject with the opposite of what I was just doing. And I think Charlie Parker is probably one of the best at really constructing his lines to keep them as interesting as possible. And I think example number 2 is probably the best example of that we're going to look at this week. All right, let's go on to example number 3, another short line that has a lot of similarities to line number 2, but let's check this one out. Here's example number 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So one interesting thing about this line is that he actually starts it with exactly the same phrase as example number 2, but it's over a different chord, which that could be a whole different discussion that we could have. Right now we're just talking about vertical versus horizontal, but I do think that's interesting. So we see him start with a nice arpeggio, and then he immediately, very, very quickly changes direction, starts playing a scale line. Halfway through measure 2, we see another arpeggio. He's just going up 3, 5, 7, 9. And then in the last measure, he ends it with a little rhythmic flair. I love the rhythmic layout of measure 3 of this line, but he's also using much narrower intervals and playing off of the scale a little bit more. So through these 3 examples, you should really start to see how Charlie Parker is controlling and thinking about the texture of his lines, wider intervals versus narrow intervals, and how he very, very seamlessly switches back and forth between the two. Another great way of starting to identify some of this stuff is to open up the Omnibook and just look for the texture, because on paper it looks very, very different when he's playing horizontally versus vertically. So these differences are really, really easy to spot. So if this is an idea that grabs you and you think, all right, I want to investigate this a little bit further, use the Omnibook as a guide to figure out all the different places that he's doing this. It's very, very interesting to see how he switches things up and how much he uses this texture trick to keep you listening to his solos. All right, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Definitely let me know if you have any questions about anything. And remember to grab the PDF and sign up to support this podcast by going to our Patreon site. That's 10minutejazzlesson.com. Click on one of the Patreon banners. Get yourself signed up today and you get instant access to everything. Thank you to all the patrons that have been supporting us at this point. Really couldn't do this show without you. Hope you're all having a great week and staying safe and healthy. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week with another episode. Bye, everybody.